welcome to this episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax.
As we all know, tennis can be a very frustrating sport. So frustrating, in fact, that players talk to themselves a lot and not always in a productive way. This is what in sports psychology is referred to as self-talk, and we all have it. Sometimes it's in our head, and other times it's out loud. If you have struggled with your self-talk in the past, this is a great episode for you. So since self-talk is such a common theme for tennis players, Brian and I wanted to learn more about it, and we decided to reach out to an expert on this topic who also happens to be a very accomplished tennis player, Dr. Judy Van Raalte. Judy is a professor of psychology at Springfield College, a certified consultant for the Association for Applied Sports Psychology, ASP, and is listed in the United States Olympic Committee Sports Psychology Registry. She has presented at conferences in 18 countries and has published more than 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals. Her research has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, the NCAA, and the International Tennis Federation. She served as president of the American Psychological Association's Society of Sport, Exercise, and Performance Psychology, and as president of the International Society of Sports Psychology.
And as Josh mentioned earlier, she's a fantastic tennis player. We actually both have some personal connections with Judy. I've known her since 1995 when the two of us were, back then, there was actually a 5.0 circuit in New England. We were both playing that before moving into the Opens. And Judy's been ranked number one in a number of categories, both I think Women's Open as well as other age group categories. So not only is she an expert in self-talk and in sports psychology, but she's just a great tennis player who, if you were to watch her play, is extremely mentally tough. And I know, Josh, you actually met Judy this past year, right before the pandemic hit.
Exactly. Yeah, my action's a little bit more recent. In early March, which seems like a lot longer ago than 7 months ago, I was presenting my master's dissertation actually, which is about mental toughness within college tennis, and I presented that at the conference that they held at Springfield, the ASP regional conference there. And shortly after that, as we all know, the world really was turned upside down by COVID-19. But really enjoyed that conference and the opportunity to present that research there, and met Judy at that point. And I think I know everyone will really enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, I think it was a really great conversation, and I think just going into it, the one thing I would ask listeners to do is to listen in for some hints that can help you develop the self-talk that's going to work for you. Self-talk is a very individual type of thing. And so I hope that you can get some clues on how you can use self-talk in a much more productive manner so that it helps you get what you need in specific moments in a tennis match. So with that, let's listen in to our conversation with Judy Van Raalte. Well, today we want to welcome a very special guest, Dr. Judy Van Raalte. Judy, thank you for joining us today on the Tennis IQ podcast.
Nice to be here, Brian. Thanks.
You're welcome. And I think what we'd like to do to begin is to understand a little bit about your background, because I don't know if everybody knows. I mean, obviously, you're a professor of psychology, but maybe not everybody knows. People in New England will know that you're a tennis player, and quite a good one. So can you tell us a little bit about how you got into tennis, and then maybe how did you transition to sports psychology, etc.?
Yeah, sure. I started playing tennis as a kid, and I grew up in a relatively rural area where there weren't many things I could do independently, and a neighbor had a tennis court that I could walk to. And so I started playing then. I started playing competitively and playing tournaments. And one of the things I noticed pretty early on is the player who was the very best tennis player didn't always win the matches or the tournament. And I found that kind of fascinating, probably because I wasn't the very best tennis player, but also because it seemed like there were a number of things that were going on with tennis that would maybe allow for a look into factors other than just how well you hit a forehand. And I think that was part of what got me interested in sports psychology and tennis at a young age. And that interest has continued to this day.
And about, how old were you when you started to realize that? Because I think some players come to that realization early, some never come to that realization.
So I think I was a pretty quick study in figuring out that my first tournament match I ever played, I lost 6-0, 6-0. It's possible I won 1 point in the match, and my tennis instructor, who was an outstanding teacher, said, well, you started this way and you won a point, and soon you'll win points and then games and then sets, and one day you'll win matches. And so I think that was exciting. But also when I looked at who was winning the matches, it became clear there was some variability. The other thing I noticed at about age 14 was there were a lot of girls in tennis who between age 14 and 16 started becoming more interested in boys and their social life and less interested in competitive tennis. And I thought that if you had the mindset that allowed you to stick with it, even if they were better than you, if they dropped out, then then you were in the game. And so those observations, I think, were ones that were very clear to me and encouraging to keep working hard and learning all aspects of the game.
And like you said, you became more interested in sports psychology. And I think one of the reasons that we wanted to talk to you today is that I think an issue that many tennis players have is the nature of their self-talk, which I think is one of your, areas of study, one of your things that you've decided to dedicate much of your time to. Um, I guess maybe at a high level, what do you think are the big challenges about tennis that causes self-talk to be somewhat problematic for players?
Well, tennis is a really hard game. And so I think that it can be extremely frustrating. I have a colleague who's a distance runner, a marathon runner, and he talks about, you run a marathon, and at the end, whether you did well or you did poorly, it's all out there. You've got nothing left. And maybe you even feel like, sort of jokingly, but you want to die because you're just so exhausted. And I said, well, it's sort of like that in tennis, except it's so hard and so frustrating that there's plenty of matches that you finish where you want to kill yourself. And you're still dead, but you're not maybe as exhausted. So I think self-talk comes into play in part because the game is so frustrating. I saw it when I was in graduate school and I was watching, I went to Arizona State University, and there's a tradition of very fine tennis teams and tennis players there. And I was matching a match with someone else, and a player missed a shot and shouted out "pig," and the other person who wasn't a tennis fan said, what's that? Is that a tennis thing? It was like, no, the athlete was too slow. They didn't get to the ball. That was maybe because they ate too much. And if they ate too much, they were a pig. And therefore a missed drop shot was pig. And I don't even have to explain another athlete who shouted out, "Eat another donut. Why don't you?" when they missed a shot. So although body weight is not the fundamental issue, the self-talk and how that affects players and their ability to play was something that's pretty visible in tennis, that we can all see and hear.
Yeah, some of it we can hear, probably more than we probably should, right, Josh? You were just
Absolutely.
mentioning that earlier, that we often hear a lot of self-talk.
Some of the craziest things that people wouldn't say to any of their loved ones, they'll say to themselves or call themselves on a tennis court. I think we see that a lot. How did your academic interest in self-talk get started?
So one of I guess I would say I was interested in sport performance. And for my master's thesis in graduate school, there was at the time a company that was producing a product that guaranteed you would improve your game if you watched their video. And it would subliminally implant better tennis in your brain. and you couldn't buy one and copy it and share it with friends because the secret sauce that was in the video wouldn't be copyable. And so you had to buy their product. And so for my master's thesis, I tested that video product against videotaping athletes and also the regular feedback that coaches give to look at their performance, and found, I know you may not be surprised to learn this, but the expensive video did not cause them to learn better than the other techniques. And as we were doing the study, we noticed, and also noticed observing other matches, that people explain their performance in kind of complicated ways. So one of the things that had struck me, I was in a graduate class and learning about how people explain success and failure. And the theory I was learning about showed that people tend to take credit for their success and to blame external factors for their failure. So why'd you do well on the test? I studied hard and, worked. And why'd you do poorly? That professor, unfair, and you see it in other areas as well. And then actually, I wasn't watching other players. It was myself. I was at a tournament. I had a friend come with me, and I lost to a younger player. And in the car on the way home, I said, wow, if only I had been more aggressive and come to the net more. And my friend said, so I was trying to blame myself for failure. And he said, oh, no, I think that wouldn't have helped at all. When you came to the net, nothing good happened. So really to blame an external factor for failure, which should make me feel better. And as you are nodding, I see that you can understand I didn't feel much better. And I went on and, well, maybe if I just, and he was like, oh, I don't think so, no. And so in the end, he didn't have to walk home, but I thought about it, and it really made me think that this self-serving bias that applies in most arenas where we want to blame other things for our failures and take credit for our successes doesn't always happen in sport. And sometimes in sport, blaming ourselves, if we care about it and we want to perform better in tennis, can be an effective strategy. And when I looked at attributions or explanations people give, I studied actually college players during NCAA tournament, warm-up tournament, and looked at how they explain their successes and failures. And that really led me right into what are they actually saying to themselves? And that seemed to really tie into how people performed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I just remember myself as a young player. I grew up at a tennis club where, and this is in the 70s, so tennis was super popular. I'm probably 8, 9, 10 years old, and there are older kids there, 15, 16, and then many of them are very good. And their self-talk, their audible self-talk was sarcastic and funny. I was entertained by that. And they got a lot of attention because of it. So I ended up copying what they were doing, which ultimately really wasn't a great thing for me. Although I would say, I think every one of us may react differently to it. Some of us are able to get over it and move on, and others can't. Right. But the content of my self-talk in general wasn't terribly helpful. And I didn't really fix that, Judy, probably till I was about 30. So it took me a while. But how do you think, maybe that's one way people learn self-talk is by observing others and noticing it. But what are some other roots or causes of that?
I think you identified a number of things that make self-talk so interesting and complicated, because you talked about how it affected you, and you talked about in different circumstances, different people respond differently, and maybe you do as well, and that you learn some from other people. And then also some of it really reflects how you feel. I mean, that people say things, they don't have to hear anyone else say it. It's how they feel in that moment. And so I would say there are a number of avenues, that there are some people who never heard a horrible self-talker, and they themselves are, very self-critical. So I think there are a range of processes. And I think for me, I was interested in particularly what are the effects on the player and on the performance of the self-talk, because I think watching other tennis players, your own experience, not just tennis, but other sports, there are many ways that people learn self-talk. And I'm going to throw in one other area that's just interesting to consider. Very young children talk to themselves, so, and they often say things out loud when they're learning, like when they're counting, it's one, two, and two more is three. And so one of the ways we learn is by saying things out loud. And then as adults, we tend to not say things out loud because we sound maybe or feel we might sound not as smart or as competent. But it is the way that humans learn to use self-talk in some capacities. So I just wanted to say it's not crazy or wrong to or silly to use self-talk, that people talk to themselves across the spectrum.
Absolutely. And I guess also based on your research and based on some of your personal experiences, how do you conceptualize self-talk? So if you had to, break it down, what would that process look like?
Yeah, so I think early on, because we watched a lot of tennis players, we looked at self-talk and gestures because there's a lot of calling a higher being. People sometimes hit themselves in the leg or the arm to kind of get going. And so we saw all of that, the fist pump, is really part of that goes along with self-talk. But as we thought about it, to be precise and really look at the talk part of self-talk, we began to look at not gestures, but self-talk and sort of separate it from images and really look at what we're saying in terms of words or language. So talk that's addressed to the self could be out loud, it could be internal, and uses language is the definition that we used. And I would say, in response to something Brian said, he mentioned the sarcastic self-talk, that it got a reaction. And so we also have looked at self-talk people use and looked at the reaction that other people have to it, because even if it's directed at yourself, there may be some effects that happen that affect your opponents as well, or the crowd.
Oh, sure. I can, it just I wonder if based on the populations that you study, um, have you perhaps seen a shift in how self-talk manifests itself in college tennis over the years? Um, just having coached a lot, I just feel like there's so much of the commands after individual points than there used to be. But maybe that's anecdotal. Are you noticing anything like that from a research perspective?
So overall, studying the self-talk usage that players are using overall, I don't have a database dating back, but I do think that there are norms in terms of what's acceptable. And there was a time where if you hit a shot and you celebrated your opponent's loss, that was disrespectful.
Yeah.
And now it's seen as appropriate or encouraging. I did recently, I think I was really struck by it, the level of some players. And I just asked the player, like, how was that for you after the match playing that come on player? And the player I was talking to said, oh, that's what people do. I didn't even notice it, which was interesting because, I would imagine some of the come on is for you and some of it is to catch
Right.
your opponent's attention. But if there's enough of it, it tends to probably have less of an effect. People, become numb or used to it.
Yeah, people adapt. Sort of like I think people adapted to Andy Roddick's serve at one point, right? Beginning of his
Mhm.
career, nobody could return it. Now everybody can return that, and so maybe to a certain extent like that. Um, let's go just a little bit deeper into self-talk as a construct, because I know in your research you talk about System 1 and System 2. Can you explain that? Because I think it could be helpful for people to understand where different types of self-talk may come from a cognitive perspective.
So I'm going to back up a little bit to
Sure.
bring you to what happened with that. There was a time when we were working as our research group and we said, like, what do we know about self-talk? And wouldn't it be great if we could kind of consolidate and put together everything we know about self-talk? And so we had a group and we came up with a plan. We were going to read every research study that had ever been published on self-talk and summarize it. And we would then be able to answer the question, what do we know? And it's kind of seems like reading the encyclopedia or something, like what a task. But we had a team and we were eager and we were gonna get the answer. So we searched the literature, we collected the articles, we made a spreadsheet, we were all ready to go. It took us maybe a year to begin. We were going to get new articles coming in. We're all sitting at a table. We have a plan of how we're going to analyze it, and we start, and everyone's reading and quiet and thinking, and I look around the table, and everyone's doing that except for Andrew. And Andrew was a philosophy major. So Andrew kind of moves at his own pace. And so we're okay with that. And, kind of like, all right. And we wait, and then we're working and working. And finally I say, what is it, Andrew? And Andrew says, if we already know everything that we know, then why would we talk to ourselves? And so we kind of pause and we look at Andrew, and that's a good question. But then we're really motivated because here we are, day one, we're doing the thing. And so we like, okay, whatever. Yeah, go, Andrew. And then we keep reading. And still he's sitting and sitting. And finally we're like, all right, question 2, what is it, Andrew? And he says, when we talk to ourselves, who is talking to whom? And there's not one study that we've copied or downloaded that addresses either of those questions. And we just kind of stop, because if we can't answer that or have anything to say about that, then we don't understand self-talk fully. And so we set the whole giant spreadsheet aside and we take a deep dive into the literature to answer some of those questions. Who is talking to who? And why would we talk to ourselves? And we eventually come to Daniel Kahneman's work. He's a Nobel Prize winner and wrote Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and really came up with or reviewed these ideas that there's some processes that we have when we think that are very quick. That's the gut feeling of, yeah, come on, or a less favorable term, oh gosh, maybe when you miss a shot or something stronger that just kind of comes out. It's very quick and often emotional gut feelings. And then there's a much more logical, intentional process. Maybe that's a self-talk that when you're listening to this podcast, you're thinking, oh, wow, this is what I want to do moving forward. That's what I intend to do. And you think about it and you remind yourself and you actually do it. And because these ideas were ones that the ancient Greeks had, Sigmund Freud had. They came with labels and also some assorted baggage. With Freud, it could tie into sexuality in her childhood. With the Greeks, there were other issues. Kahneman named them System 1 and System 2. And the gut feeling, quick stuff was the System 1 self-talk that you just blurt out, which just comes from maybe spontaneously the heart. And the System 2 is most of what was in all of those research studies that we didn't review for that giant paper, which is, what do you intentionally use and what do you try to use to help your performance or to respond? So System 1, your gut feeling. System 2 might be what your coach or you tell yourself to do.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful. And I know I've used that a lot with my students to let them know that, some of this negative stuff, it's going to come up. And it's really more, are we able to respond to it with a System 2 statement? Or do we let System 1 just run the show? Because that can happen.
Yeah, and I think sometimes your System 1 self-talk, like what I hear you saying is, if you get too negative, you may start a spiral out of control where you're so negative that you're not playing anymore, you're distracted. And I think that's problematic. sometimes when you're negative, you're giving yourself a clue like, hey, I just shouted that. I apparently am losing it here. And so you may not have to counter that negative self-talk. You may need a drink. You may need to walk away and take a deep breath. So um, I don't always want people to be fighting themselves with their self-talk. You're a jerk. Well, no, I'm not. Well, you might be. Well, you're. So that for some people is too much. But that system one self-talk can be an early warning system. And if it's going all the time, it's really hard to play good tennis.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really liked that question from Andrew about breaking it down in a more philosophical way about who really is, who am I talking to, or who's talking to who here. To me, it actually reminded me a lot of the book the Inner Game of Tennis, breaking that down into self one and self two, and the really the mind and the body, and who's talking to who here. So I really like that story. A question is, how can we, in your view, can system one be changed? Can it be trained to be more rational and to be improved over time so that automatic response is a little bit more productive?
Yeah, so I think you ask such an interesting question because sometimes people imagine that their gut feelings are things that can't be changed. I remember when one of my children was small and I said, "What did you just do to your brother?" And he said, "I hit him." And I said, "Hitting's not okay." And he said, "I had to hit him." Like, a voice spoke to me from above saying, "You are unhappy with your brother, so you must hit him." And he did not perceive it as a choice at all. And I think some people feel that way about their self-talk, like it just comes blurting out. But we know with high-level tennis players and also people who play in tournaments that if you say some things, you get a warning or you lose a point or you're thrown out of a match. So Roger Federer, for example, was a child who was not the kind of tennis player that many people would be proud of to have on the court. And when he was no longer able to play, when he behaved in that manner, he was able to change what he did and said. And it appears that Novak Djokovic, although it wasn't what he said, it was his behavior when he had a gut feeling to act in a particular way, is able to change that to a certain extent. So with some practice, that can be changed. And also, it's not easy to change. It takes some effort.
Yeah. And I feel like that's actually what I went through, Judy, like to help me. And I think, and perhaps it was the right age for me to dive into stuff like Stoic philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, but also understanding the nature of the sport a little bit more, because I think many of us as tennis players put an overemphasis on the importance of points when points are really just a means to an end. And once we realize that the only thing is really changing from point to point is the probability of one player or another winning that particular game or even the match. And those were just some thoughts that, as over time, like, oh, okay, I get that. I haven't really lost anything here. There are very few points that during a match where you actually lose things of consequence on the scoreboard. It's either a set or the match. Other than that, you're in it. And it really helped me realize, oh, it's okay. I have another opportunity on the next point. But I know getting one to that realization is not an easy journey. But I feel like the one more learns about this very devilish sport mentally, perhaps that can also, because it feels like system one in a way is like your early warning system. It's your threat detector. Something's going wrong here. And very often it's overactive.
Well, and I think you made a nice observation that that sometimes when athletes and tennis players in particular start to lose their focus, it's because they're spending a lot of time in the past. I can't believe that happened. I should have won that point. I should be beating that player. Or in the future, I'm only a few points now. If I win this next game, something good is going to happen. And that spending time in the present is likely to be, for the bulk of the time, is likely to be helpful. Now, it is useful to reflect on the past, right? Because if your past strategy isn't working, then having some reflection on the past or some anticipation of where you are in the future can be valuable. And that's what makes it so tricky. Because if you only needed to stay in the present all the time, then we could work on that. But when you need that movement of a little bit of reflecting and using that moving forward, it really makes things complicated.
Yeah, to me, it seems like all the sports psychology has that little bit. You're on a fine edge constantly
Mm-hmm.
of it can't really be one way or another. And I know everybody's different. Everybody's personality, what sort of self-talk works for them is different. But as part of your research, do you look into specific exercises or interventions that can help people discover what the best self-talk might be for them?
Yeah, you're asking Brian the $1 million question. What is the best self-talk for me to use under which circumstances? Because the self-talk you would use in a lesson or a training session might really be different from what you need in a tournament match. So in a lesson, maybe you had, if you're a kid, you might have spent a long time in school, had other responsibilities. Then you come to the lesson, you're tired, and you really need to push yourself, and you're doing something hard and working on it. So maybe that self-critical voice gets you fired up. You believe you can do it, and that gets you moving. And then in a training match, you've seen this person before, so what you're focusing on with that opponent might be different than someone you haven't played a lot or someone that you see in a tournament. So I think being aware that the context matters and that the self-talk for one place might be different from another place is really helpful. um, I think of it a little as the tournaments, we tend to rev a little high, be excited and fired up. So, to be aware that you could push yourself a little further than you need to go. And then it may be really helpful or appropriate to fire yourself up. So some experimentation is really helpful. I'm thinking of Billie Jean King and pressure is a privilege. So I'm going to imagine that she might have said something else to herself when she was in a lesson. But pressure is a privilege is a way of saying, I'm lucky to be here. I already accomplished a lot, and here I go. And so that maybe is a little more calming and focus on the moment kind of self-talk. That helps for some people, but there's others who, what would be bad for you who has become more mindful might really work for them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. So another way that self-talk is often broken down is, and this is more on the positive side, is more instructional self-talk versus motivational. Um, in your research or in other research out there that you've explored, is there an advantage to using one versus the other, or it's ideally using a combination of both? But how? What are the advantages of using each type?
So I'm going to share with you a description of two specific studies that we conducted comparing different types of self-talk. One of the things we found is that for some people, adding self-talk actually disrupts their performance, that it's too much or they only need to use self-talk in certain circumstances. So in one study, we had people doing golf putting, and we found that instructional self-talk helped them be more consistent when they focused on the instruction. They chose their own instruction, and we gave them a list of things that golfers say to themselves. We did a survey of what golfers say. Our negative self-talk list was X-rated and we couldn't publish it, but in any case, it was what they actually say to themselves that they shared with us. And that the instructional self-talk led to more consistent performance and less disruption. So some of the more positive or motivational self-talk and also the negative self-talk could be disruptive for people overall. Now, any one individual could be different. More recently, we did a study with self-talk and scuba divers. And we were interested in, does self-talk help you when you're in a sport where you could die? Because if you do your things wrong, then you can drown. And what we found again was, all things considered, the instructional self-talk helped people be more confident and help their performance when they were getting certified and taking their certification exams. So that says to me, there may be individual differences, but if you were trying it out, some instructions that work for you. And the instructions could vary. So if you're a beginner, it might be racket back, ready position, racket back, step. And if you're a more advanced player, it might be follow through, racket head speed. So the type of instruction might change, but that could be helpful. When you're in a tournament match, if you're paying a lot of attention to your strokes, that suggests that that may be the wrong place to be focusing. And we do have a sense that on match day, your fitness is the fitness you have. Your forehand is the forehand you have. And if it's working today, fantastic. And if it's not working today, then you have to figure out how to hit something else. And that's where your self-talk might help calm you down, get you moving and hitting more backhands or more volleys, doing whatever else you need to do to perform.
Yeah, I think motivational self-talk really all about like kind of moving your arousal levels or confidence levels, and I feel like even myself in a tournament, that's probably what I'm using more. Because as you said, if I'm thinking instructional, I'm probably in a losing situation at that point. And even if I do, I want to make sure it's sort of with an external focus. I know for me, more about hitting targets or hitting a trajectory rather than, oh, what's the angle of my wrist on my forehand right now? Then I'm just going to overthink that piece of things. So I think it's good to understand the purposes of those. Do you? I don't know if you look at this at all, Judy, but pairing self-talk with some of the other interventions that are rather popular in sports psychology. Imagery is a very popular thing. Novak Djokovic practices or has some sort of practice with respect to visualization. Have you looked at how self-talk can work with that type of thing?
So I'm a fan of self-talk, but I also know that there's a great deal of variability in terms of how self-talk affects people. And one of the things I've run into when working with athletes is an overabundance of self-talk. So people get, they're just like, I can't get out of my own head. So I love, Brian, your description of your self-talk, which might be go for the target. So that kind of self-talk, it's very in the moment. You're not thinking about the past or the future. It's really, this is this point. That sounds like you might be someone who your self-talk is effective. But there's other people who are, I can't believe I missed that. I said to go for my target. I didn't go. What am I thinking? Look at the match over there. And then you're stop being so negative. You need to be positive. And so one of the pairings with imagery that I found for people during competitions is to identify, rather than fighting themselves, to use an image that might convey how they'd like to feel. So some years ago, I had a tennis player who described themselves in a match feeling like they wanted to be stalking the ball, stalking their prey, invisible, dangerous. And so a black panther was how they wanted to feel, like quick, you don't know when I'm going to strike, I'm calm, and I am dangerous. And so using that when the self-talk started revving up, just kind of not fighting against it, but switching to that kind of image, that person found it extremely helpful. So self-talk was helpful in some contexts, but being able to have other tools, or I guess we would say a plan B or a plan F, that you can use when you're in need, is really a nice thing to have during a match.
I love, yeah, I love that the discussion about the present moment, and not thinking, being caught in thought about what's been happening, or whatever has happened leading up to the match, or during the match up to that point, or what might happen if I win this game, if I win this point, or if I lose this point. How about pairing self talk with mindfulness? Because as we know, the being able to focus on the present moment is very challenging for a lot of people, and can be oftentimes needs to be trained.
Yeah, so it's such an interesting question, Josh, because mindfulness is sort of being in the present moment and aware, and self-talk is being aware of your cognitions and using a tool. Whereas if you were, completely in the moment, you wouldn't be maybe as much thinking about your thinking. But I do think that you're right, that our experience has been that when people are playing, and I guess we'd say in the flow or in the zone, they tend to be aware of the past points enough to make good decisions, to be playing in the moment and hitting their targets, and then ready for what the future brings, and able to kind of seamlessly do that. And when they're stuck in one place or the other, the past or the future, that sort of bringing themselves back to the moment is a way to do that. That's a mindfulness approach, and that reminding themselves with self-talk can really be helpful. Um, I remember playing a national tournament myself, and on grass, which is not a surface many of us get to practice on, and playing an opponent who was, we'll say, a challenging opponent, and thinking about, I beaten this person in the past, and now, it doesn't mean anything. If I don't beat him now, right, then it proves that, blah, 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 blah. And then using really what you said, Josh, of it's what an opportunity to play on grass. It's so beautiful here. And just and it's a really nice moment to get to play this match. And if the other person wins, they win, and if they don't win, they don't win. But the moment of being here is wonderful. So it sounds so I guess I'd say so sports psychology that I apologize to the people who are cringing, but can be really helpful to bring you back to, I love playing tennis, and it's great being out here. And just the rest doesn't matter. And that can be extremely helpful in also playing better and enjoying the game. And if you enjoy the game, then you're able to train harder and continue to play better.
I mean, I like that story because I think really, Judy, you just showed a fundamental shift of like kind of not wanting to be in a situation to embracing it and understanding it. And I think that's a huge part of handling any sort of challenges that come along in tennis, because many come, and if we can just embrace it and accept it, it is what it is. So I might as well just throw my best at it and enjoy that process and learn from it, as opposed to avoiding it, which the only thing I'll learn there is I shouldn't have avoided it. I should try to do what I should be doing. Given that self-talk is obviously still a major issue with tennis players, let's talk a little bit about what I think is a problem in all areas of science, is that gap between research and application. How are we doing as tennis coaches with helping players develop self-talk? Or do we need a better connection between the research side and the practitioner side?
So I'm not going to speak for all coaches, but I do remember a team that I watched, and I saw a player after a match, and the player had played a decent match and was just beating themselves up, extremely verbally negative. And the coach came over and kind of comforted that player. And there was another player who had lost, and was more like, that's what happened. And the coach came over and really, talked to the player, like, you need to care, you need to try, I don't know what's, like, step up your game. And so my observation was that when the player was negative in training and self-critical, that the feedback they got, they were like preempting the coach. And that the feedback they got from the coach was, you're really trying, you need to calm down. And in a way, that was teaching the player to continue to be negative. Um, and and it's a caring coach who sees an athlete being very negative and struggling, who tries to comfort that coach and help them. And if an athlete doesn't have enough commitment, it is a caring coach who's really trying to help push an athlete further. But I can see that there are many factors that are involved in what's going on with self-talk. And so I think it's helpful for coaches to learn about self-talk, to be able to share information with their athletes and realize that there may be many different approaches. I'm going to share one other study we recently conducted. It was golfers. Golf is easy because they stop in between. So tennis is hard because it's ongoing. And in this study, golfers were hooked up with a beeper, and the beeper went off randomly while they were playing. And they weren't asked really about their self-talk at all. They were asked, what, if anything, were you experiencing when the beeper went off? And so someone would say, well, I was saying to myself, you got it. And then the researcher would say, were you saying it in words? Was it a feeling? Was it an image? Like, what specifically was it? And people really got trained to identify, was it talk? Was it a feeling? Was it an image? Was it nothing? And it turned out there was this huge range. So there were some people who talked to themselves quite a bit. And there were other people who basically went through the day and the beeper went off and they're like, nope, nothing. I just am. And I wasn't really noticing anything at all. And, the self-talk was, some of it was, racket head speed on the golf club. But some of the other self-talk was, those people have a very ugly hedge. Why is it on this golf course? So, it wasn't all that we might have imagined, and that a very little bit of targeted self-talk could go a long way. And that the people who study and are interested in self-talk might be the self-talkers among us. So I feel like I revealed myself a little as telling the story as a self-talker who studies self-talk, but I know that that's not as important for everyone. So coaches who are aware of that and can kind of ask or even try some drills and some competition and games with, self-talk and less self-talk to individualize things for their players, that could be helpful. Or they could reach out to someone who's knowledgeable about sports psychology and bring them in, really see what does their team want to work on. And if this is an area, get some support so that they can support their athletes.
Absolutely. I'm just thinking back to your story about maybe not playing your best, but noticing what a great opportunity it was to be playing on grass. I've actually had that same thought myself recently as I've started working at the International Tennis Hall of Fame, and I have that same opportunity. And it's tough when I'm reminded of that. It's tough to be upset in that moment. I also had a situation where it was the only time in college that I lost six love. It was during our spring break trip out to California, and we were playing at Indian Wells, which if you've been there, and your other listeners have been there, it's one of the most scenic places in tennis. It's just such a gorgeous location. And I just remember being frustrated with my match, but looking around and seeing what a beautiful landscape, what an opportunity this is. So being able to shift that focus onto something a little bit more productive, or even just philosophical, thinking about what an opportunity, why is it that I play itself, can be very helpful. So I guess another question that I have is for tennis players that may be listening. Any other and we talked about this is not a one size fits all type of thing. It's not that we're just going to say this is the best. That's the $1 million question. This is the best type of self-talk. But I guess just, more general advice for tennis players that are listening, and how to improve that self-talk, whether that be internal or external.
So I think, Josh, you just gave us all a great example of your self-talk during what some people might think is a really crummy match, and that you could have been really angry and frustrated. And if you were angry and frustrated all the time, you probably wouldn't be playing tennis today. And here you are working in a fantastic location. So I hope that those of us in New England and maybe around the country and around the world will get to see that in person, because it's a special place there. So I think, reflecting on your self-talk, if you find that you're beating yourself up a lot, um, it makes it really hard to enjoy tennis, and it might help you improve on a particular day. But in the long run, it's just kind of a crummy way to be. And so I would recommend, maybe shifting to some of the imagery approaches to give yourself a break, or think about the kinds of things you might recommend to a friend or to another player that could be helpful, and try it out. Um, Most of the time, thinking about or trying out what works for you can be helpful, usually short phrases. So, when you said targets, that's, the word targets may remind you of what you're trying to do. Enjoy might be something believe, as a professional tennis player used or wrote. Could be something that you put, that you write on your shoe, could be a note card that you put in your tennis bag. I think Serena Williams sometimes writes down some tips for herself. And those might be a strategy, but those also could be, could be self-talk words that might involve joy. Yeah. It could be a reminder about a strategy, backhand. So I think brief, something that you feel comfortable using, and then to be able to reflect on it and learn for it. If it works, stick with it. I'm going to share some great wisdom I had from, I'm going to call the person a consultant. I was playing at a national tournament, and I was playing the person in my age group who was number one in the country, a top player in the world. And I was not number one in the country or in the world. And I was playing the match, and I had a parenting mishap. So my son was at the match with me and sitting on the sideline, and he was a younger child at the time. So I had to kind of keep an eye on him and play my match. And as I'm playing, I see him stand up and start to walk away. And so we finish the game, and I go over on the changeover, and I say, "What are you doing? Are you okay?" And he says, "Oh, Mom, I'm going to get some water. I know right where it is. I'm fine. And if it's not working, try something different."
Wow.
And I did, and it was extremely helpful. So that little tidbit of piece of self-talk from a very wise coach. So where do you learn it from? Anywhere that it's helpful for you, is some self-talk that I've used. It's not very complicated, and simple, direct, for me, a little bit funny because I appreciate snarky children. And so I think that that's some of the things that people can use, and then to see if it works or is helpful for them.
Judy, that's fantastic. And I want to thank you for joining us today on the Tennis IQ podcast. This was an awesome conversation. I know I really enjoyed it, learning more about you and just about self-talk in general. And I'm sure all our listeners have enjoyed it as well. So I just want to say thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure to talk about tennis and self-talk, and to join you as well on this podcast. Thank you both.
Thank you, Judy. Well, that was a great conversation with Judy, and we'd like to thank Judy again for coming on the podcast. So, Brian, what was one of your big takeaways from that conversation?
I think the thing that I find really fascinating about self-talk is that we actually have different self-talk systems in our brain. So, as Judy described, system 1 versus system 2. For those of you who are interested in reading more about that, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and slow is a good resource for that. And so system one is more that automatic system. It's sometimes barely controllable. It's probably not even controllable in certain ways. But system two is that slower and hopefully more rational perspective that we can give. And that's a big part of what many of us use as tennis players when we're talking to ourselves in motivational ways or instructional ways. Not that system one can't be trained as we asked in there, but at times it needs to be followed up with some more rational self-talk, some more motivational or instructional self-talk. So I thought that was it's at least good to understand that, Josh, that that's where some of these things are coming from, right? So, well, that's our show for today. Once again, many thanks to Judy Van Raalte for joining us today on the Tennis IQ podcast. For more on today's show, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag of TennisIQ. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your platform of choice, which includes YouTube, so that you can be notified of new episodes. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.